Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about personhood and healthy relationships. So, of course, I want to talk about personhood in the Bible, and I'm certainly wanting to talk about some text in the Gospel of Luke. But before we do that, you can't, in my opinion, you can't talk about personhood in the Bible without talking about Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Genesis, very first book in the Old Testament, the First Testament, Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, any number of ways of talking about that body of literature. Now, let me telegraph right up front, I am not all that concerned about the science versus religion debate in these texts. Not nearly as concerned as some are. Science has its point and its place, and religion has its point and its place. Do they come together? Absolutely, absolutely. It's just not a debate I'm particularly interested in. I think the earth is old. I think God put things in motion, and I'm fine, just kind of embracing a scientific worldview, as long as it doesn't get in the way of a biblical worldview. And I think this debate about Genesis chapter 1 and 2, for me, okay, I speak for me. I don't speak for anybody else. I speak for me. I think that obscures what's actually going on in Genesis 1 and 2. I'm convinced by a German theologian named Klaus Westermann, who believes and writes that creation texts are about worship. Okay, now let that sink in for a moment. Creation text, whether Genesis 1 and 2 or in the Psalms, you have them elsewhere, creation texts are about worship. Worship of the God who is above creation, not about science. Wow, that's a pretty fundamentally important theological perspective, because that means that what our primary duty would be is to interpret Genesis 1 and 2 based, or maybe I should say it this way, against a backdrop of worship. This writer is trying to tell us something about the way he, potentially she, probably he, worships God. Well, that's really fundamentally different than much of the debate that we hear today. So one of the things that I think happens in Genesis 1, 26 and 27 is that the Bible democratizes human beings. And what I mean by that, I don't mean Democrat versus Republican. That's not what I mean. What I mean is when the Bible says in Genesis 1, 26 and 27 that God creates humankind, male and female. I've got a friend of mine, also an Old Testament scholar, who calls them the dirtling, or the dirtlings. And it's good Hebrew. It probably will never play in a written translation of the Bible, but it's a good translation of the Hebrew. So anyway, in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, God creates humankind in the image of God, male and female. Right there, by the way. It's not male in the image of God and females are just an add-on. Male and female in the image of God. What is the image of God? Well, personally, I think the image of God has much to do with the ability to will. Because I can will something, I have an exercise of will. I can determine that I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. That's very much in keeping with what we see God doing in Genesis 1 and 2. But there's something else going on here. At this time and at this place, this text is written either as Israel is getting ready to go into the land for the first time. That would be a very early date for the text, maybe as early as like mid 1450s in BC, or it's written as Israel's getting ready to go back into the land after the Babylonian captivity. So that would make it the late 500s. There's a lot of debate about that. The later date is the one that's generally accepted. In any event, so Israel is getting ready to go back into a land that is adversarial to them, certainly, but also they have been ruled over by kings. Now, kings at this time, whether you're talking about the mid-15th century or the late 6th century, kings are thought to be gods. But here this writer comes along and says, wait a minute, male and female are created in the image of God. Do you see it? It's not just the king, it's not just the queen, it's not just the little princes and princesses. All human beings are created in the image of God. So if all human beings are created in the image of God, then there isn't a place that the prince or the princess or the king or the queen has in relation to God that's better than me. They are not gods, as I am not a god. They are subject to God, but we're all on this plane together. Now that has this impact on the reader that says, I am responsible directly to God. I have the same responsibility to God as the king or the queen has, and has kind of two things happening. So kings and queens are brought down, all right, as everybody else is lifted up. We're all on the same playing field here. What is biblical personhood? Biblical personhood is recognizing that we together as people are the image of God. Not the king, not the queen, not you, not me, us. We're all there. And that's liberating. It's liberating in a theological sense. It's also liberating in terms of our practice. How do we treat other people? This course aimed primarily at nurses. It's important, especially when you have people. My wife spent a few years working in the emergency department. And in the emergency room, I would guess, maybe it's not the case, but it seems to me, based on Sue's experience and what she's told me, that if there's ever a place that you see people at their worst, the most traumatic, the most vulnerable, it's there. Sometimes that vulnerability is a result of their own actions. And it's at that point in a nursing practice, it would seem to me that my spirituality, recognizing that I am subject to God in the same way as this person is subject to God, and this person is on the same kind of plane as me, that helps me with the idea of dignity, respect of that individual. That individual needs dignity and respect just as I need dignity and respect. And you could apply this to police officers, you could apply it to attorneys, you could apply it to carpenters, you could apply it to welders, you could certainly apply it to preachers. Spent a dozen years in the ministry, right, before I came to higher education. You can apply it to professors. Personhood in the Bible has us all on this democratized plane in relation to God. Nobody's better than anybody else. And that gives my life dignity, but in a certain sense, my life only has dignity as I see the dignity in others. So, a little bit about Genesis 1, 26 and 27. We'll come back in a minute and we'll talk a little bit about Luke's gospel.